Okay. So we're starting a new quarter. We're going to cover Genesis in one quarter, and good luck with getting through that. I hope you got the material. A couple of comments as we get started. There are notebooks back there with the questions that I've put together to try to cover each chapter. Please do those lessons, okay? I'm not going to necessarily go through every question, but the questions are designed so that you can not only look at the material, but give some thought to the material that we're going to cover in each class. There's a schedule in the beginning of that notebook, and so we're going to try to stay on that schedule even if we don't finish up one lesson, because we only have 21 lessons. We're going to have to move pretty quickly through the story of Genesis, and so please do the lessons. And I know what happens. What happens is everybody does the first 2 or 3 lessons, and then they quit doing the lessons. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to come to your house and give you a bad a bad review on Facebook because you didn't do the lessons. But if you want to learn anything about Genesis, do the lessons, okay? And the reason that I say that is if you're going to have to do a little bit of looking to do the lessons. And that if you don't pay any attention in class, if you don't do anything else, at least doing the lessons will help you somewhat. Number 2, what am I hearing? Is there an alarm going off? Oh, an Amber Alert. Okay, yeah. Somebody's at services and nobody knows that they were going to services this morning. So, number 2, trying to decide how to teach Genesis. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've ever taught Genesis. I've taught, I think, everything else except maybe Isaiah. Every time we come to Genesis, somebody else wants to teach it, and so there are some real challenges to Genesis. Especially the first 10 or 11 chapters. So the rest of the Abraham story is not terribly hard. As far as practicality, I'm going to try to offer some practical observations, but they're going to be interspersed. Now, I'm not going to take 10 minutes at the end of every lesson and go, here are practical applications. I will try to draw some of those out. I would suggest that you do so. But this is essentially a fundamental study, okay? It is imperative that you understand and get some of the things that happen in Genesis, because so much of the Bible story relates to what happens in this record. And so that's what we're going to try to underscore, that this is not intended to be 22 or 23 sermons where you walk away with some point of edification or correction. This is history that is intended to be understood as a building block to your knowledge and to your faith and to your understanding of Scripture. So that's the perspective we're going to take. And also, and I've got a question in this first lesson if you did it, about perspective. One thing I do want to underscore as we get started is the perspective from which Genesis is written is a perspective that you need to maintain as you study it. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit, but I want to say it again. Please give attention to that statement. The perspective from which it is written is the perspective that you need to keep in mind when you study it. Okay? It's not written in a vacuum. It's not just blank history. It's history with a purpose. And then here's the last introductory comment. We are not going to answer all your questions in this class, because I don't have answers to a lot of the questions that grow out of Genesis. And I'm not only talking in regards to the first few chapters. The more you study Genesis, there are just questions that are left unanswered. And please appreciate that when you study this book, there are places when speculation, you just start whittling on God's end of the stick, and God just doesn't offer us every answer to every question that we'd like to find. And the one I'll throw out as an illustration, and it's the one that always gets asked to me by someone who's skeptical, what about the dinosaurs? Okay? And here's my answer to what about the dinosaurs. I do not know. Okay? I do not know, and I'll tell you why I don't know. Because the perspective from which it is written. And like I just said a minute ago, studying it, you have to understand the perspective and keep the perspective in mind, okay? So those are my introductory comments. Here's the last thing that I would mention. I have not taught Bible class publicly for 6 months. This is the longest in my life since I started preaching that I've had a break from teaching Bible class. So, I may be spinning my wheels a little bit for the first couple of weeks till I get re-engaged. I hope not, but, if you go, man, that was kind of all over the map, just remember I'm out of practice, okay? So, Genesis chapter 1. Turn your Bible there, and then I want you to flip over to Hebrews chapter 1, and I want to begin with this thought as we start looking at this first chapter in the Bible. Hebrews chapter 11, did I say Hebrews chapter 1? Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 starts this way. Hebrews 11 and verse 1. Now faith is the substance or that which stands under, or the foundation is the idea, of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. By it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. That's an important statement to think about as you begin Genesis, because we are approaching this study and this chapter, this idea of the creation, simply from the perspective of, I'm trusting what God's told me here. I'm trusting what's been written here. And if you get in a discussion, an evidentiary discussion with someone, and they want to argue about evolution and tell you as a creationist you have no proof of what you believe, I would say, okay, I don't have a lot of proof about what I believe. What I have is lots of evidence for the reliability of the Bible. There are a lot of reasons. I mean, archaeological, historical, geographic, on and on and on we could go. There are a lot of reasons to believe that the Bible is credible. And the Bible includes this account of creation. And that's why I believe it. And that's what the Hebrew writer says. We accept the facts of creation as they are presented to us by faith. I cannot prove to you that any of this stuff happened. Not in the way that we go about proving things. And I'm going to tell you, the sooner we accept that, the better we'll be at dealing with the subject in the world in which we live. And here's the thing. An evolutionist is operating from the same perspective, because there is no proof, not proof in regards to the way that empirically we go about proving things in this world. There's no proof of the Big Bang, and there's no proof of macroevolution. Okay, we're all operating on faith, and so I want you to get that in your head at the very outset. If you've never stopped and thought about that. When you look at the creation account, you are accepting the validity of it based upon the validity of everything else God tells us. Okay? And part of the reason that's true is, who was there to see the creation? Who's your witness? God. The one who did it's the only one who witnessed it. Okay? So I want you to start that way. Now flip back over to Genesis and let's run through. I'm going to try to use these questions as a kind of guide to go through the lesson. Number one, it's important to stop and think about this a little bit. I'm going to do an introduction the way we typically would. But who, as you understand it, who wrote Genesis? I'm sorry? Moses wrote Genesis, okay? Other than skeptics or liberal theologians who try to take the Bible and subject it to higher criticism, which says that it's a collection of writings by groups of people, and the way that they do that is based upon the different names that are used of God. The reality is, conservative scholars have long believed, I believe, and this is the way I'm going to present it, that Moses is writing Genesis, and Moses is recording the creation, the tables of nations, the events of Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, and then all these things about Abraham. Moses is recording them as God's dictating them to him, which partly accounts for why it is written the way it is written. And here's back to my point about perspective. From what perspective did Moses write this? Do you understand the question? Anybody want to take a shot at that right quick?
I think he wrote it because what he's trying to do is you got to realize he wrote to a bunch of people as slaves.
Okay.
They didn't really understand God.
Okay. What is Israel's place in the scheme of man's redemption? The nation Israel, what part did they play in bringing man the opportunity for salvation? Do what? Okay. Fundamentally, Israel's role was to bring the Messiah into the world. Okay? And a lot of the Old Testament restrictions upon God's people are restrictions in order to keep them separated. For instance, in parts of the genealogies can be offered in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 that prove that Jesus was truly the descendant of Abraham and David. Okay? So I want you to appreciate that Moses is writing this not just to satisfy our curiosity. He is writing this because here is a nation of people that are all the descendants of Abraham. Sometimes we forget the 12 tribes of Israel, they were just one big family. They were all cousins, okay? And tracing their lineage back to Abraham, and you see this in the Bible, it's not as clearly outlined, but it is there. Every nation in the earth at some point came from a family. You follow me? So did Israel. But Israel came to being as a nation much, much later than many of the other nations that you read about, for instance, in chapter 10 and in chapter 11, where you have the table of nations and these people ended up here and these people ended up here and these people ended up here. Well, God's helping the children of Israel to understand how they came into being and why. Why is it that Israel grew up as a nation? Why did God deliver them from Egyptian captivity? Why is it that they had maintained this distinction? And there's all kinds of peculiarities. They live in the land of Goshen. They are shepherds by trade. They're an abomination to the Egyptians. The Egyptians aren't going to intermarry with them for the most part. They maintain a distinction. Well, that's very rare in human history. Why did that happen? Well, when Moses is writing Genesis, he is helping the children of Israel as they've come out of captivity understand where they came from and why they're here. God is using them. God is going to make them a nation of His own, and everything in the Bible is written from that perspective. What is the role of the nation of Israel in God's plan to bring man deliverance from sin? That's the way Genesis is written, okay? So when somebody asks you, why aren't dinosaurs ever mentioned? Well, because my knowledge of dinosaurs has nothing to do with forgiveness of sin. It has nothing to do with bringing the children of Israel into a nation of their own from a family that started off in Ur of the Chaldees and ended up in Canaan, and why are they all in Canaan? And all these questions that you have about the scheme of redemption, the fundamentals are in Genesis, okay? And so, no, as a preacher and from a Bible standpoint, there's a lot of historical questions that we cannot answer, that I don't even try to answer, because the Bible is history written with a purpose, okay? So that's the perspective. And so everything we talk about, I'm going to keep coming back to this. Why did God tell us this? Because the children of Israel needed to know it. And we need to know it as the heirs of the promise. Does that make sense to you? Yes? I got 3 head nods and the rest of you just looking at me. Okay. I know we're in the auditorium. This is an interactive class. And I'll probably go, huh? But please feel free. Okay? Phyllis? I've got a whole chapter to cover this morning. Just remember that. Hang on to that. Okay, we're going to come back to that. Just hang on to the thought. Okay, I'm not avoiding it. Hang on to the thought. Number 2, what's your perception of the affirmations in verse 2? Now, this is somewhat speculative. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But in verse 2, we jump over this when we study Genesis. We go right to the days of creation. The earth was without form and void. The darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. You got an explanation for any of that? This is why this is very hard. I mean, this is like teaching the very end of Job, because the answer is God says, "Where were you when I did this?" You know, I'm not sure we would fully understand it all. I just wanted you to think about it. As I understand it, what God's telling us here is when He originally created the heavens and the earth, it was not in the form as we understand it. You know, people talk about continental drift, and they talk about the rise of this and the rise of that, and how things were in ancient times, and how I have no idea how all that was. In fact, what God seems to indicate is when He created the earth, it was what we would call a planet, but there was water covering everything. There was just the fundamental elements that God created all together, okay? And He wants us to understand that He created it in that kind of basic form. It was without form, it was void, it was empty of any kind of life, really empty of much organization. And the darkness on the face of the deep, some people think the deep is space, but the reality is we find space mentioned a little bit later, and that's a question that he just really doesn't answer much. The fact that he talks about the Spirit hovering over the water says to me that the deep is that you had a core and everything's covered by water. That's the way I understand that, because later on he's going to divide those things. The most interesting thing is the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the waters, which raises several questions, and here's what I would offer to you as perhaps what this is telling us. All of God was involved in creation. You know, Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, there are several places, John 1, tell us that Jesus was actually the one who was the active force in creation, that Jesus created. Reflecting on this, here's a possibility. Okay, God is the mastermind behind creation, God the Father. God the Son, as the expression, the Word, as John 1 tells us, is actually the one who's expressing what needs to be done, and the Spirit is somehow or the other working as a power. And this goes to the New Testament, the miracles that Jesus did. Somehow or the other, Jesus and the Spirit were acting in concert, because we're told that. And I can't differentiate all those roles distinctly. What I do think is we are told that God in all three of His beings is active here, okay? And the Spirit is awaiting God's design to be offered. And so that, and again, this is whittling on God's end of the stick. I recognize that. I just offer that as an observation. Don't ignore those things. Think about them. Just be careful about being dogmatic in your conclusions, because God doesn't explain it to us, okay? Number 3, what did God create on the first day? Light. After He had already created what? This is interesting to me. We skipped this part. What else did He create on the first day? Huh? Yeah, light and darkness. The heavens and the earth. Yet, okay, we forget verse 1. That happened the first day too. He created the heavens and the earth and said, let there be light, and there was light. And God identified light as good and divided the light from the darkness, and He designated day and night. What's the irony about light and dark in the first day of creation? Anybody? No sun, moon, and stars yet. We understand light from a scientific point of view to be radiated energy, okay, that occurs at certain frequencies that our eyes can detect. I mean, there's microwaves we can't detect. There's the stuff that's cellular. There's all kinds of radiated energy. Light is radiated energy at a certain wavelength that we can see with our eyes. What's interesting is radiated energy always has a source. Something is producing it. And yet there's no sun, moon, and stars, and I find this fascinating. God designed the concept of day and night before He ever created the processes that rule in day and night as we understand it. For us, day is what? Huh? Okay, day as opposed to night is what? It's the period of time during the day when it's light. What determines that? And the rotation of the earth. Okay? Sun's here when the earth rotates and we're facing the sun. Our part of the earth, it sees day. But when there is no sun yet, it boggles the mind. Okay? And what I want you to see is God is expressing to us things that He is capable of that are beyond our realm, first of all, of understanding, and second of all, even of the way that our world presently works. God is creating. And for that reason, I think we need to be really careful that we don't impose all of our understandings of the present world on creation. Does that make sense to you? When you think of what's happening in day 1, 2, or 3 in terms of how things work now, please remember, God created light and dark, the absence of light, before He ever gave us a source of light. I'm assuming God to be the source of light, and there's times when God does not emit that influence on His newly created world so that there's dark, but He also designates for us, this is what I'm going to call a day. All right? Light and dark, the morning and the evening are the first day, even though there's no sun yet. Okay? I think that's going to play a part in the next couple of verses. And this goes, Phyllis, I told you to hang on to your question. This is a good time to bring up this question. The days in Genesis chapter 1 are subject of some debate, the length of the days. Okay? Are they 24-hour periods? Or are they much longer periods? And basically there are two fundamental camps of understanding. Okay, there are all kinds of variations, but there are two fundamental ways of looking at Genesis 1 in regards to time. The first one is the proposition that the days of creation are not 24-hour periods. Okay, and that they are very long periods of time, as we understand time, that describe God's activity. And part of the argument for that would be you've got light and dark, but they don't have anything to do with the rotation of the sun and of the orbit of Earth around the sun or the rotation of the Earth. Well, that's a good point. Okay? Are they the same periods of time that we understand? Because those elements are not there yet. People who hold to this view, and I know some conservative-minded people that entertain this view because what it offers is an explanation for things. Fossils, if it's the natural process that we understand that creates fossils, that requires a tremendous amount of time. If you take the genealogies in Genesis and you start adding things up, time-wise, I think Phyllis said, according to something you've read or your standard, Genesis takes about 2,000 years. We really don't have any idea about that. If you take all the genealogies and add them up, you're going to come up with a figure. Okay, but 2,000 years doesn't account for the fossil record. 2,000 years doesn't account for the geology of the earth. 2,000 years doesn't account for things like radiocarbon dating. Okay, and I'm not trying to raise doubts about your faith. What I'm trying to say is, once again, this is written from a perspective. God doesn't answer all of our questions, and it's possible. It's not my view, but it's possible that what you have are great lengths of time. Sometimes this is called the old earth theory. Sometimes it's called the day-age theory, that a day is really representing an age, maybe even an eon. The other theory is the more traditional conservative view that sees all of these taking place in a 24-hour period as we know them. I lean in this direction personally, and I will tell you why. It doesn't necessarily account for the fossil record and the geologic record and carbon dating. However, it's possible to find great lengths of time in other places in the Bible. Okay, I'm not one to think that necessarily the genealogies are sequential, and that there's nothing else that goes on in between. You read the genealogies of Jesus in Matthew chapter 14, it's 14 generations at a time. There are people that are left out. Why are they left out? Well, because they used methods of memory in order to offer the primary facts about whatever they were trying to prove. Okay? So I think you can possibly find lots of time in the Bible that if you just read the Bible's not there. Okay? And so they don't have to necessarily be in the days of creation. The other thing is, once again, if God uses terminology that we understand, a morning and an evening is a day. To you and I, a morning and an evening is the rotation of the sun, right? We've established that. Same thing to the Israelites. Remember, that's who this is written initially for. I would propose God's using language they understand. Okay, and one of the big questions, and I called a friend of mine, and we had a discussion about this week, who is really very much an expert in these matters. I rely a lot on reading. He has studied himself in Old Testament history, in Jewish history, Jewish mythology, ancient mythology. One of the challenges to the 24-hour theory is that when you go to chapter 2, which is an expanded view, God creates Adam, God creates Eve, all the animals are created on the same day. Adam names all the animals. You have an expanded view of what happens on the sixth day. Some people argue Adam couldn't have done all that stuff in 24 hours. And my response to that is, if God wanted him to, he could. Okay? So you can choose which view you prefer. Those who believe in theistic evolution, that God created everything in its fundamental form and then let it evolve. If they are creationists, and there are many who are, theistic being God-begun evolution, they'll take the day age or the old earth theory and say God created all these fundamental things. And the reason that we believe in evolution today is because it really did happen, but God started it all. So they try to meld those two theories together. All right? My proposition, the way I'm going to teach it is, these are 24-hour periods because that's what the Israelites understood. Okay? And that's what we understand. Even though there's no sun, moon, and stars yet on the first day, and you have a day and an evening, you have light and dark. It's fascinating, isn't it? The rest of it's pretty straightforward. Hang on, Phyllis. If I can get to the end, I'll come back to it. Or ask me after services, okay? We've only done the first day so far. So, day 2, what happens on day 2? Huh? Okay, the firmament. Okay, God made the firmament, distinguishing the waters from under the firmament from the waters that are above the firmament. Firmament, as I understand it, is what we would call the sky. And the waters above is what we would think of atmospheric moisture, clouds. That's where rain comes from. And the waters below are the waters that are going to become the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, waters that are connected to the earth, okay? There's some interesting ideas about what the Jews thought about the firmament. I'm not going to chase that rabbit right now. But essentially what he's telling us is the second day, God created what probably is essentially the water vapor cycle, okay, as you would understand it in scientific terms. On the third day, what did God create? Okay, you've got not necessarily creation, but the separation of land and sea. So the land rises out of the waters are set in places. And interestingly enough, you have references. Isaiah makes the point of God limiting where the oceans can go. You can come to here and no further. And we understand much of this has to do with gravity, with tidal influence from the moon. Here again, this is interesting to me. You don't have a moon yet, and yet you've got water separated from the land. Some of the reason that happens the way it happens is because of lunar impact and gravity. So once again, be careful about associating all of our scientific understandings with the process of creation. He separates land and sea. Interestingly enough, he says in that separation, in verse, where are we? Verse 9, and it was so. Verse 10, He called the dry land earth, He called the gathering together the waters seas, and God saw that it was good. Yes, I think one of the only times where God renders a judgment on something He's done before He's finished with the day's work. I think that's interesting. I don't know what to make of it. I just think it's interesting. What else did He create on the third day? Yeah, vegetation. The botanical world is all created on the third day. And one or two things to note about that. The next question really addresses. Number 6, according to its kind. What does that mean? Let me just ask you, what did you answer? According to its kind, what does that mean? Do what?
Like itself.
Like itself? Okay. Yeah, I think there's two things inherent here. One of them is God created the divisions as we understand them. And he even mentions you've got grasses, you've got herbs, which would be, I think, vegetation that you eat. And then you've got fruit trees or you've got trees. Well, that's the way we would divide the botanical world. And I think part of the according to its kind is God made divisions. He's going to say that about marine life and birds and animals, land animals. But the other deal is he mentions it according to its seed, with its seed in itself. And part of this is the principle of reproduction God created. You plant a tomato, what you going to get? Are you ever going to get anything but a tomato? No. Why? Well, according to evolution, you might get any number of weird things, okay? Or at least the beginnings of such. But the reality is God made the process of reproduction something that He designed where everything brings forth after itself. And that's going to be very important through the rest of creation. Fourth day. What did God create on the fourth day? Huh? Solar system, sun, moon, and stars. Okay, we've already had 3 days, and here's an interesting observation. If you're ever in a discussion, and this will almost be used against you, in evolution or Big Bang theory of origin of everything, you've got to have light before you can have life. Now that's all changing somewhat as they prod under the oceans and find life in the absence of light. But for years, you always had to have light. And so the Big Bang happened, and then evolution came as a result of it. You have plant life before you have a sun in the days of creation. Now, God's the source of light, apparently. And so that's how these things can grow. But nonetheless, you have plant life before you ever have a sun, moon, and stars. Why He did it that way? I do not know. Maybe just to help us understand. God's the source of life, not the sun. Because remember, in ancient days, the children of Israel came out of a society, Egypt, where the sun was one of the primary gods. And yet, life was created on the earth before there was ever a sun. I think that's fascinating. Fourth day, what did God... Oh, sorry, that was the fourth day. Sun, moon, and stars to give light on the earth, which says that at that point, God handed off the source of radiated energy from Himself to the planets that He designed. Okay? Fifth day, what did God create? Okay, marine life, all marine life, and that's a wide array from microorganisms, plankton, those kinds of things, all the way through shellfish, through mammals, marine mammals, fishes, all kinds of life. And notice again, according to its kind. And then winged animals as well. So all birds, again, according to their kind. And you have the judgment, once again, of God at the end of verse 21. God saw that it was good. And now you have one other thing in verse 22. What else does God tell them? Verse 22. Go multiply. So God expected these things. It's not going to be a constant process of creation. God's designing the world so that the world will operate according to laws that God has put upon it, and life is going to reproduce. Okay, so then you get to the sixth day. What did God create on the sixth day? We're now down to verse 24. Land animals and man. Okay, a couple of interesting things here very quickly. First, I think it's interesting in verse 25. He said, God made the beast of the earth. Verse 24, God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature. Theistic evolutionists really grab hold of that and say, well, everything grew out of, God put the principles of life in the ground, and everything evolved out of that. But if you look a little bit farther, you'll notice that it says in verse 25, God made the beast of the earth according to its kind. So I think the reference in verse 24 is these are animals that live on the land. And once again, you have the divisions. You have cattle, domestic animals. You have creeping things, which would include the insect world, everything that moves closely on the ground or in the ground. And then you have the beast of the earth, what we think of as wild animals. And according to its kind, God made everything its designation. God made everything so it reproduced according to itself. And once again, you have an interruption before creation is finished that day. God saw that it was good. And then verse 26, God said. Now it's interesting that God gives us a glimpse of His discussion. And there's obviously a discussion between the beings of the Godhead. You've got the our and us. But we've already been introduced to God and the Spirit, and God speaking. Those are what we understand the three beings. So here you have, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. This is a distinction from the animals. In chapter 2, what element did God use to make man? He's made of the dust like the animals are. And yet at the same time, there's another aspect to man's creation, and that is that he bears the image and likeness of God. Let me ask you this real quick. When you see the word image or likeness, what do you think of? Huh? Appearance? A mirror. Okay, yeah. It's appearance. That's the way we use the word image. You know, something bears the image, we would say, well, if it bears the image of a book, then it's going to look like this. Or it's in the likeness of a book. Don't discount that. I hear people all the time argue, God doesn't have a body. Well, we don't know that. We know God doesn't have a material, physical, temporal body. But there's no reason to think that God is some kind of, like the Force in Star Wars. He is a being, okay? And personally, I think our bodies are probably made in some way to look like whatever God looks like, okay? But that's not the extent of this. That's the natural reading. The extent of it is we have a moral capability, we have a spiritual element to us, we have a will, we have reason, we have all these things that the animal world does not have, all of which are included in the idea of the image and the likeness of God, even though we're made of the same stuff that the beasts are made of. Okay? This is a very pregnant statement, and you can never, I think, track down everything that it includes, but any distinctions between man and the animal world, this is where I would put them. Okay? And then a couple of other things. Let them have dominion. Man was intended to be a steward of God's creation, and you see this in the next chapter. That's what Adam's responsibility was in the garden. And ultimately, here's something that I also find fascinating. Remember perspective. This is all written from the perspective of the children of Israel and the part that they will play in the redemption of mankind. What is Jesus' place right now in God's world? He is what? Huh? He is Savior. I'm talking about His world, not just man. All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. Okay? That doesn't just mean about sin. Who is in charge of everything God created? Jesus is. Psalm 8 talks about man and his relationship to creation. Hebrews chapter 2 addresses that Jesus is the fulfillment of that prediction and statement in Psalm 8. When man is told to have dominion over everything God made, ultimately that took place in Jesus. I don't think that's an accident, and I don't think I'm putting together things that shouldn't be put together. I think that's here on purpose. Ultimately, while God was in control of everything He made, eternally it's going to be a man who was God, who will be in control of everything God made. That's fascinating to me, folks. And it is very biblically rooted. So give attention to that. God said they're in our image, they have dominion. Verse 27, male and female. I'm going to reserve that discussion for the next chapter because in chapter 2 he's going to elaborate upon that. And then what's God's, I think the next question is what was God's, what was his evaluation of his work after every day? Number 10. It was good. The last day was very good. I think this is both a quality. I don't think this is a moral statement. I don't think it's saying this was good and not evil. I think what he's saying is this was very satisfying to God. This is what God designed. This was God intended. And this was a satisfaction to God. And then number 11, what was his first action to man and his first command? What did he do to man? Blessed him. That's an important element. God gave his blessing's the only word I can think of. He commended man to do the work that he was supposed to do. He empowered man to do the work that he was supposed to do. He directed man. All of that's inherent in the idea of blessing. Interestingly enough, we're going to see that repeated with Noah after God destroys everything and he starts over. Same command to Noah as you have to Adam and Eve here, okay? And the Jews, that'd be a big deal to the Jews. We just kind of pass over it. So he blessed them, and then what's the first command? Be fruitful and multiply. I'm going to throw this out. This is speculative. I recognize that. There's going to be some of that. Just you can chew on it. I don't make any big doctrinal thing from it. I do think it's interesting in verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them, and God blessed them, and God said to them. Notice he starts using man in the plural. I don't want to be a heretic here, but I think it is possible that God created other men. I can tell from some of your looks, it's like, oh, you're kidding me, right? I'm not holding anybody to that. But, we're going to start running into questions. Somebody's going to ask it. Where did Kane get his wife? Well, his wife was either a sister, if Adam and Eve were the only people, or after Adam and Eve, and after all of this, God created other people. I find nothing that threatens my faith from that possibility, okay? But I'm undecided, okay? I just think it's interesting that he starts talking about man in the plural pretty quickly. And that may just be usage because he's going to be dealing with man, not one individual, but as a whole down the road. So there you go. For those of you who are thinking, hey, we're going to entertain all kinds of wild-eyed theories here. Well, there's your wild-eyed theory, number one, that you can entertain. Verse 29, the last question. What made man distinct? Anybody? Yeah, he's made in the image and likeness of God. None of the other animals are. Okay? Don't forget, that's what makes him distinct. And again, remember perspective. The Jews need to remember who they are. They're made in the image of God. Okay? And what we're going to find out over the next couple of chapters is the only reason that God's made them a nation as they are is to fix the problem that they forsook the image of God and did not become godly anymore. And the reason that Israel's going to exist is because God's using them to fix sin. And that's what we learn in Genesis. That's the fundamental point of Genesis, the whole book. One other thing I would have you note, look at verse 29 before we finish up. God said, see, I've given you every herb that yields seed which is on the face of the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it will be for food, also to every beast of the earth, every bird of the air, everything that creeps on the earth, in which there's life. I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. As I understand it, originally God designed everything and everybody to be vegetarians. Now, here's the implication of that. Before Cain and Abel, actually before the sin in chapter 3, animals were not killed for anything. They weren't killed for clothing. Adam and Eve clothed themselves with plants once they realized they were naked. It's not until Genesis 9 that we see God offering animal life as food for mankind. Personally, I'm really thankful that he did, because if it weren't for ribeyes, I'd be a little frustrated, okay? The reason I bring this out is the flood in a couple of chapters is going to be partly a result of violence on the earth. Originally, animals didn't kill each other for food. And when God starts making the observation, and this really starts with Kane and his descendants, Lamech is noted for his violence. That the violence that man introduced into the earth was not limited to man. I think it's very likely that the violence you see mentioned in chapter 6 means that everything God had designed had started to devolve into a world that was not what he originally designed. That animals didn't kill each other, that there was a relationship here. And Isaiah chapter 11, and I'll leave you with this, Isaiah chapter 11, a very famous messianic prophecy, talks about in the messianic kingdom, what's the lion and the lamb going to do? Lie down together. I would propose to you that's a way God originally designed things. And we can talk when we get to chapter 3 about the relationship between man and animals and all that kind of stuff. But there's some really fascinating little tidbits of information here that you can chew on. But what this begins for us is the children of Israel understanding how things got to be the way they are, so that God can prepare them for an understanding of who they are in God's plan. Okay? Wednesday night, we'll do the second lesson, which is chapters 2 and 3, so please give it some attention. Okay? Thank you.